we'll be looking at being well on the pathway in 10 years' time to hopefully prosperous and successful circular economy for plastics, where all different forms of plastic recycling are recognised.
Welcome everyone. We talk a lot about the circular economy, but today we are moving past the buzzwords and getting into the gears of the machine. Right now, Europe is at a crossroads. On one side, we have the massive potential of chemical recycling to solve the plastic crisis. On the other, we have a complex web of new end-of-phase regulations that could either accelerate this industry into the future or pull the handbrake on innovation entirely. Joining us today is someone who lives in the intersection of these two worlds. He's the CEO of Plastic Energy, a global leader in chemical recycling, and a man who spends his days turning plastic waste back into a valuable resource while navigating the shifting sands of European Union policies. Ian, thank you for joining us. Let's get right into it.
Thank you for taking the time.
Right. So let's cut to the chase. The industry is holding its breath over these draft end of waste rules. Why is this specific piece of paper such a do or die movement for recycling, chemical recycling right now?
So look, there's an awful lot going on in the regulatory space at the moment, particularly in Europe. For the most part, it's extremely positive. So the industry is transitioning to one that was very much based on voluntary targets around the start of the decade to one where we'll have mandated, regulated targets for recycling of various kinds of packaging, and that those particularly come from the packaging and packaging waste regulation. What's been going on, what goes with that though, is an awful lot of what to most people would be boring but important detail. And there are various parts of the regulations that will facilitate meeting those targets, which are currently being discussed and debated. And they will all be very, very important for people being able to make investment decisions ahead of the targets kicking in 2030. So to come to your specific question on end of waste, it is really, really important that we regulate the process of something ceasing to be a waste, right, and becoming a product again. I mean, that's fundamentally what recycling companies do, and it's fundamentally what the circular economy does. And we are completely in favour of that process being exceedingly rigorous. It's very, very important that our waste streams are well regulated so that we know where they go, and it's very important that when something is made back into a product again, people can be trusted. The specific bit of regulation that you are talking about, which is the subject of consultation, the number one thing to realise is it's not written for chemical recycling. So it's written for mechanical / physical sorts of recycling, and it's that's not what Plastic Energy does, and therefore I wouldn't profess to be an expert, but I think it's broadly understood that it probably works for those kinds of technologies. Okay. The risk here is that it sets a difficult precedent for instance, chemical recyclers like ourselves. And I think, so there's a strong argument that, like I say, it's not for us, wasn't intended to regulate chemical recycling. It specifically talks about being for mechanical and physical kinds of recycling, and therefore we should not be concerned. But we also do know that precedent is very important, and precedent is very useful to policymakers. And in fact, if you want consistency of regulation, knowing that you can look to precedent is quite important. And if you take this as a precedent for chemical recycling, we don't think it works, and therefore that's why it is a little bit of a concern, while we all recognise that it's specifically not intended for our kind of technology.
Okay. Okay. So there's a worry, that we are defining success by the process rather than the actual environmental results. As you said, in the real world, why is that distinction more than just semantics?
So chemical recycling pyrolysis companies such as ours produce a intermediate product. So we take an end-of-life plastic from a post-consumer stream. This is material that would otherwise go for incineration or landfill, largely, and we turn it into an oil which can be used as a substitute for the virgin fossil fuels which would otherwise be used to create plastic. We consider that a product. Okay. It is regulated as a product from the plants that we operate today. Right. But it is not the end plastic. Okay. And it is not ready to be made directly into another piece of plastic packaging. Our material, TACOIL, as we call our particular form of pyrolysis oil, is used by the petrochemicals companies in their production facilities in order to make plastic, which is then, or to make polymers, which are then ready to be used into a new plastic product again. So our concern about the consultation on the end of waste regulation is twofold. It does not recognise the importance of these intermediate steps, which in our view are product steps. It also puts at risk, arguably, the status that product already has from ours and other people like ours operations, in that it does specifically state that if you already have end of waste status, you may not have it in the future, and that's obviously regulation changing on you when you're already operating is one of the things which people in business find the most difficult.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about money. Investors hate the word maybe. How does this regulatory fog impact the decision to open the wallet for new chemical recycling plant?
Yeah, so I think we have to be careful with this, that people often will say, business hates regulation, etc. So the reality is that businesses like ours that work in the environmental arena and that are providing environmental solutions to difficult problems do absolutely rely on regulation, because we fundamentally rely on regulation recognizing the external economic costs of not doing things in a sustainable way. So we do absolutely want to work positively with regulators. We recognize the need for regulation, and we think regulation is positive. And like I say, the targets that have been set for this industry through the 2030s are exceedingly positive for us, and they're an important piece of regulation. And when it comes to, as you say, opening people's wallets particularly for new projects, right. So real new production facilities, investment in plants like the ones that we have invested in recently. These boring but important detailed regulations have a very, very, very big influence on people's willingness to invest and people's willingness right. to invest at a certain time. Right. So there are a number of areas, regulating what we produce as a product, as we've discussed, the approval of the accounting mechanism for the materials passing through the system. So that's something called mass balance accounting, which is another piece of regulation of the circular economy, which we're seeing emerging. And there are another number of other elements of detail, and these elements get very much amplified when you are talking about a specific investment decision that could be measured in tens or hundreds of millions of euros.
Right. So are we accidentally handing a get-ahead card to international competitors by making our own rules too restrictive? Could Europe get left behind in the global recycled materials market?
So I think it's very well documented that the two industries that chemical recycling straddles are both very, very challenged in Europe. So the general market for recycling and recycling companies has had a very, very challenging period, and the European petrochemicals industry, we also know, is in a very exceedingly challenging period. The fundamental competitiveness of the petrochemicals industry in Europe compared to others globally is definitely challenged. I think that is uncontroversial. So it's important. In terms of it is, though, I think the evidence is pretty clear that European regulation, when done well, provides a positive stimulus for this industry, and the majority of the leading companies in the area of chemical recycling are based in Europe and have their first operations in Europe. So I think we look at the market globally, and we still see Europe as the most obvious opportunity, but it's obviously a market that the continent needs to grab.
Okay. Ian, think about the big brands, the Nikes and Unilevers of the world. Will these rules make their recycled plastic shopping list impossible to fill?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't. I think, you mentioned the brands, and as I mentioned earlier, this is definitely a market in transition. So around the start of this decade, it was very much driven by voluntary commitments from brands to have a certain percentage of recycled content. So now we're seeing, particularly in Europe, those targets going into regulation. I think that is to the benefit of everybody, to be honest. It gives certainty to people at every part of the value chain that what they're doing in recycled content will be valued. It's led us probably to have what we expect to be a limited period of being a little in the doldrums as we move from the market driven by voluntary commitments to one driven by regulation. But we expect to emerge from that reasonably quickly as the targets that the regulation sets for 2030 get closer. So now the regular packaging waste regulation sets targets for different forms of packaging and packaging waste. The one that we are particularly interested in and our technology particularly serves is what's referred to as contact sensitive materials, which are the kind of materials that you would have food or cosmetics or other things packaged in. And I think it is generally accepted, certainly we believe, that chemical recycling, producing an intermediate product from waste, which is then used to produce plastic through the same process as it's made from virgin hydrocarbons, is the only way that contact sensitive target in particular will be able to be satisfied.
Okay. So, right. Ian, we are in a race to scale infrastructure, So does this proposal feel like a turbo boost for the industry, or are we just adding more red tape that slows the momentum?
No, look, it is important that we get these regulations right. There are very significant investments. Like I say, at an individual plant level, us and our peers will be talking about investments measured in tens, if hundreds of millions of euros, and the investments required in order to satisfy these targets in their entirety will be measured in billions of euros. So those regulations need to be right. And it's perfectly okay, although it can be frustrating occasionally, that it takes a little bit of time to get them right.
Right.
But I think once they are got right, once they recognise all forms of the circular economy and all forms of recycling, then I think they will provide for a good support for those big investment decisions over the coming years.
Okay. So, Ian, is there a danger of winning the compliance trophy on paper while failing to deliver optimal environmental outcomes in practice?
I mean, I think there's always a danger that people get these regulations wrong, but I mean, fundamentally, we are an environmental technology, and therefore we rely crucially on regulation that reflects care for the environment, and we rely fundamentally on maintaining people's faith in the technologies which we operate, so that so we have published, for instance, a couple now of life cycle analyses that look at the impact of our technology on the environment in all its forms and seek to quantify the environmental benefit that we have. And we have one thing that we don't need regulation for, because it's inherent in our business, is that we know that we need to continually improve the environmental performance of our technology, to increase the proportion of material which goes into the process which is recycled, in the various ways in which we recycle it, and to reduce the absolute emissions that chemical processes like ourselves have, and with the eventual aim of those emissions being zero. I think that's very, very clear, and in our industry you can't be targeting anything else.
Right. If you could lock all the European Union regulators in one room until they agreed on a cohesive plan, what's the first thing you tell them to fix?
I think the key thing is holding the course.
Okay.
The targets that have been set will almost certainly be underserved to begin with, particularly in our area. We need to be making investments now in order to satisfy those targets at the levels of which they've been set. And obviously, as we've discussed earlier, there are challenges not to do with regulation in the key markets in which we operate, which are combined a little bit with some regulatory uncertainty, are causing investment to be delayed today.
Right.
It is very, very important that regulators hold their course on this. It's very, very normal for challenging targets to appear difficult to meet. That's the very reason why challenging targets are set in the first place. And I think regulators need to be confident that players like ourselves and others are working every minute to make sure that we're in a position to meet those targets as soon as we can around the dates at which they are set. So given the difficulties in the industry today, you will have voices that say that this is simply becoming additional red tape for some areas of industry. For instance, I think it's an industrial opportunity. It's a transformation that the industry has to go through, and I think it is very, very important that that regulators stay the course through what we all know is a reasonably difficult market at the moment.
Right. So what principles should guide these rules to ensure they are actually investable, technologically neutral, and environmentally credible?
So I think you hit on it. So we are in favour of a very high degree of environmental technology, environmental integrity, sorry, in regulation, because we're fundamentally an environmental technology. We do think that those regulations need to recognise the state of the industry and the very, very nascent state of the industry. So it doesn't always make sense to impose standards and costs on an industry at its very infancy that you might expect it to have in the future, for instance. So it's important that we communicate to regulators that we are constantly looking to improve our future rate of recycling, and that we are constantly looking to reduce our emissions and other environmental impacts. But like I say, in an industry today that is measured in thousands and tens of thousands of tons, targets that are going to be measured in millions and tens of millions of tons in the future, we know that we will have a different and a more rigorous set of regulations in the future, and the regulations will, if you like, tighten or get better over time. It's important not to seek to impose perhaps the regulation of a mature industry on one which is only just emerging.
Exactly. So what does Europe's plastic landscape looks like in 10 years? Are we looking at a circular economy or just a pile of missed opportunities?
Well, no, we'll be looking at being well on the pathway in 10 years' time to hopefully prosperous and successful circular economy for plastics, where all different forms of plastic recycling are recognised and fulfil their different objectives within that circular economy properly. So we are looking to make the plastic economy circular in its entirety. The plastic economy is actually a myriad of different aspects, from the chemical recycling to the physical and the mechanical recycling, and those forms of technology are all complementary if you look at the overall system being made circular. So I think it's important to recognise, as we've discussed in earlier part of this conversation, the differences and the different regulatory needs of those different technologies, but they are all inherently complementary, and they should all be held eventually, at least, to very similar standards.
Right. So Ian, that's all the questions I have for today. It's clear from today's conversation that while the technology is ready to scale, the regulatory framework is still finding its feet. In the world of growth and strategy, we know that consistency is what turns a good intention into a real-world result. For Europe's circular ambitions to succeed, that consistency needs to start with the policy. Ian, thank you for the reality check and for sharing what's truly at stake for the industry and the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to speak.